Hi everyone, my name is Tal, and this is Due Diligence. It's funny, the first video I created for this channel was a response to Cameron Bertuzzi. I started working on it months ago when I first decided to start this channel. But I didn't want to launch it before I have a slightly larger bank of videos that are ready to be released. So I procrastinated and worked on other videos. One of those videos was another response. This time it was a response to Braxton Hunter from the channel Trinity Radio. A few days after I recorded that video, Braxton released a 10 questions to atheists type video, which was the kick in the butt that I really needed. I really wanted to release a response to it, but my response to Cameron wasn't released yet. My channel wasn't even up. So I got to work. I released the first video. I started editing 2 other videos, which were also somewhat time sensitive. And at the same time, I started writing my response to Braxton's questions. Clearly, the other response to him that I'd already created will have to wait. And then this happened.
Hello, I am Cameron Bertuzzi. Welcome to Capturing Christianity. Today I've got Dr. Braxton Hunter from Trinity Radio. I want to make sure that I give you the right title here, Braxton. Well, today we're going to present a challenge to atheists.
So now I had another thing to respond to. And again, it's Cameron and Braxton, but this time it's both of them together. I thought long and hard about it and decided to actually start with this one and work my way back chronologically. So you can expect my response to Braxton's 10 questions and also my other video responding to him in the near future. Actually, you can probably expect more videos of me responding to these 2 guys. I like watching their videos, I enjoy their delivery styles, and I do find that there is a lot in there that warrants a response. But this one will be a response to Braxton and Cameron's challenge to atheists. I'm assuming here that you've already watched their video, and that the clips here are mostly just reminders for you. If you haven't seen it, then even though I do try to actually present their case as best I can, and I do believe that you can get all of it just from watching my video, I still think that you should go ahead and watch their video also. The last 15 minutes of their video are their attempts to rebut some objections, but they don't address any of my objections, and actually they really only address very weak objections. So after having watched it a few times, I feel that I can comfortably say that you won't miss anything important if you skip that part. But by all means, if you have the time, watch that too. And if you find something interesting or important in there, do let me know. Here are a few bits from their videos to illustrate what the challenge is and why they think it's important.
So we have this very clear exposition of what it means to be an atheist. On the American Atheist website, you can see here, atheism is not an affirmative belief that there is no God, nor does it answer any other question about what a person believes. It is simply a rejection of the assertion that there are gods. Atheism is too often defined incorrectly as a belief system. To be clear, atheism is not a disbelief in gods or a denial of gods. It is a lack of belief in gods. This is a billboard that they produced. Just skip church. It's all fake news. That's not just like, okay, we just lack belief in God. You're asserting that that thing does not exist. There's a tension here. So here's the challenge. Here's the dilemma. You can basically pick one. You can either A, claim to merely lack belief in God, or you can compare God to beings that you believe don't exist. You've got to select between A or B.
So I think there's actually real progress that can be made here. This has some practical value in going further with our conversations. So I would just ask that we step out of debate mode for a minute and analyze this together, even if you're an atheist.
So, first things first. They frame this challenge in terms of these are 2 things that we think are contradictory. You have to choose one. This means that they sort of preclude getting an explanation for why the dilemma they present isn't really a dilemma, which means that, strictly speaking, I can't actually accept the challenge. But I want to believe that they are actually honest interlocutors, that when Braxton talks about getting practical value that will allow us to go farther in our conversations, he is being honest. And that when he asks that we step out of debate mode, he also means himself and Cameron. So I'll assume that this framing was unintentional and that they aren't only looking for atheists to choose either A or B. Cameron, Braxton, if you happen to come across this video and you feel that my response is less than satisfactory, I would absolutely love to hear your criticisms. And if you want, I'd be really happy to have a debate or a discussion with you about this topic. I basically have two primary objections to this dilemma. First, I see it as a false dilemma. I'm willing to accept that they see these two statements as mutually exclusive, but I think that that's mainly due to a misunderstanding on their part. I think they mistakenly believe that when we say things about God, we're talking about their God. They don't fully grasp that to others, other God concepts are no less legitimate than theirs. More importantly, I think they don't understand what we mean when we say lacking belief. Now, by the way, I'm going to use we and us a lot here. I'm really only referring to what I mean by things and to how I interpret others on my side. I'm not speaking for every atheist out there. I'm actually not speaking for any of them, only for myself. But since my own views were influenced by a lot of what others had to say, I do believe that there are some significant similarities between my ideas and theirs. So I say we and us, but I actually only mean I and me. And of course, anyone else who happens to agree. Secondly, I think that even if these two statements are contradictory, it doesn't necessarily matter as much as they feel that it does. They say that our choice of A or B should influence our conversation, and I actually really disagree with them. Let's start at the last point. Cameron has some
JPEGs that I made. So JPEGs is like just a fancy word for some images. I made some images
for his explanation of this so-called dilemma.
So the first thing I want to talk about is scales of belief, and this is all going to be relevant to the challenge. So when I hear some people talk, or some atheists talk about belief in God, to me it sounds like they've got a scale in their mind of like 0 to 100. So 0 is you have no belief about P. P is just any proposition you can put in there, so like God exists. And 100 will be you fully believe that P is true. And I think some atheists think that that's all there is to the scale. But in reality, there's actually a sort of negative side to it where you believe that P is false. And so that's why I think the correct way to think about this is that you can go from 0 to 100, but you can also go from 0 to sort of negative 100.
I'm personally fine with using this scale to define where I stand regarding the likelihood that God exists. But I don't think this scale is relevant for any serious debate about the subject. The reason being that this scale isn't actually one scale. It's two scales about two separate propositions. One is P is true. The other is P is not true. Let's look at the top scale. The label on 0 is a bit misleading. No belief about P actually sounds like you can't put yourself anywhere on this scale. If 100 is labeled belief that P is true, 0 should be labeled do not believe that P is true. In the same way, the 0 point of the bottom scale should actually be labeled do not believe that P is true, do not believe that P is not true. Do not believe that P is true is not the same as believe that P is not true. I know this may not sound intuitive, so let me give you an example with the help of dear Amélie.
Oh my God, I'm petit mortified.
No, Amélie, not Emily.
Le temps n'a rien changé. Amélie continue à se réfugier dans la solitude. Elle prend plaisir à se poser des questions idiotes sur le monde ou sur cette ville qui s'étend là sous ses yeux. Combien de couples, par exemple, sont-ils en train d'avoir un orgasme à cet instant précis?
Amélie is being very specific, but let's simplify her question a bit. Is there an even or odd number of people having a petite mort right now?
Petite mort. What? Little death? It means an orgasm?
It must be either even or odd. It can't be both, it can't be neither. So let's say that Amélie tells you that the number is odd. To use Cameron's scale, let's say that P means that an odd number of people are climaxing at this very moment. So Amélie tells you that P is true. You can either believe her or not. If I were you, I wouldn't. I mean, she has no way of knowing that, right? You'd probably be at zero. You do not believe Amélie. You do not believe that the number is odd. You do not believe that P is true. But if Amélie then tells you that it's even, she's telling you it's not odd. She's saying that P is not true. You have no reason to believe her either, for the exact same reason. We know that one has to be right and the other has to be wrong, but we can still believe neither. If you don't believe Amélie when she claims that P is true, that still doesn't mean that you believe Amélie's claim that P is not true, right? You don't believe the number is odd, but you also don't believe the number isn't odd. This stands no matter what P is. If you don't believe that P is true, that doesn't mean you believe that P is not true. If you're anywhere on the left side of the scale, you don't believe that P is true. If you're anywhere on the right side, you don't believe that P is not true. Now, when P is inconsequential, such as the number of people having an orgasm at a given point in time, there is no problem rejecting both Amélie's and Amélie's assertions. But when we're dealing with something of greater importance, say something that factors into our behavior, our choices, our politics, we have to decide how to treat an answer that's not definitive. We need a default position, a null hypothesis. If we believe neither statement about P, should we treat it as true until proven false, or as false until proven true? Conversely, there are many arguments for why we should define God doesn't exist as the null hypothesis. But there are also opposing arguments. I won't go into this whole discussion here, even though it is a very important discussion to have, probably more than this one. But since this video is about what atheists say, I do think it's safe to say that generally speaking, atheists believe that the null hypothesis must be that God does not exist. Cameron's next slide
is about the burden of proof. It's very related to the previous slide. So in here, T just means God exists. So you could assert that T is false. And in that case, you do have a burden of proof. In the middle, you can assert nothing about T. And in that case, you don't have any burden of proof. But then on the further side, assert that T is true. This is the context in which most theists are operating. They're asserting that theism is true, giving arguments and evidence. And in that case, everybody agrees you've got a burden of proof. My point is that on the opposite side of the scale, where you assert that T is false, then you still have a burden of proof. The only place that you don't have a burden of proof is when you're in the middle, you're not saying anything about it.
The scale here seems very similar to the bottom one on the first slide. And Cameron directs our attention to the fact that he changed P, any proposition, to T, the proposition God exists. But he made another little switcheroo here, and that one is far more significant. The scale no longer refers to belief. It refers to assertion. This is a huge difference, and they really don't give it as much attention as they should. They sort of make it seem like these two scales are sort of interchangeable, like believing something is the same as asserting something, like believing something carries a burden of proof.
If you accept B, then what you've got to be prepared to do is defend your belief. Because if you believe that God doesn't exist, and in a conversation you assert that God doesn't exist, then you've got a burden of proof.
Sure, but in fact, you can believe something and not assert it in a conversation. And you never have to prove any of it until you actually assert it. Cameron actually has a few slips where he admits the two are not the same.
I believe, and I would go so far as to assert, that there are no tigers in my office. But if I'm doing that and I'm asserting that, say in a debate, then I've got to defend that. Then I've got to defend that.
What you assert is the thing that dictates your burden of proof, not what you believe.
If you're not asserting anything, again, we agree that you don't have a burden of proof.
Right. If you're not asserting anything, you don't have a burden of proof, no matter what you believe. I have an idea that I think is worth considering. We use the term active belief or positive belief in this conversation as a way of either saying I'm firmly on the right side or I'm firmly on the left side of this scale. Often enough, someone who'd say that is also willing to assert their belief. And if they do, they have a burden of proof. The idea that I want to bring into the conversation is that of inactive belief. The situation where you actually believe the null hypothesis, the default position. Not because you feel that you've been convinced by it, but because you're not really convinced there's any reason to believe it might be false. I don't really know if this term already exists or is used for something else, or if this idea already exists and has another name. So here I'll use this term for this idea, and if anyone corrects me in the comments or if I find other information, maybe we'll have to use a different term to describe it. Let's take Cameron's example here.
There's a real question about whether or not you believe that Santa doesn't exist. And I think most people have that belief. They believe that Santa Claus does not exist.
Yes, I agree. I have that belief. I believe that Santa Claus does not exist. But not because of all the compelling evidence. It's just the default position. I hold an inactive belief that Santa Claus does not exist.
You actually have reasons to think that Santa Claus does not exist.
But honestly, they're not the reasons why I have that belief. I'm not sure that if the burden of proof was on the side claiming that he doesn't exist, I'd be convinced by these reasons. In any case, I find that there are far more convincing reasons to believe that God doesn't exist. But that's not really the point right now. I believe that there is no Santa mainly because it is a very reasonable null hypothesis. To be clear, we can accept the null hypothesis without also inactively believing in it. The easiest example is the presumption of innocence. Even if we are pretty convinced that someone did something wrong, we can still accept the null hypothesis that they are innocent and operate on the basis of it if they haven't been found guilty. So, an inactive belief is not really about what you've been convinced of, it's more about how you feel about the null hypothesis. I don't think it's possible to have an inactive belief in something that's not the null hypothesis. Or maybe I should say that having such an inactive belief is somewhat self-contradictory, because accepting the null hypothesis means that you accept that this is the idea that you shouldn't reject without good enough reasons, yet you still reject it without good enough reasons, because if you had good reasons, it would no longer be an inactive belief, it would be an active belief.
I can have a meaningful conversation with an atheist who says, I merely do lack a belief in God. I'm at zero. But I shouldn't then expect to hear that same atheist on Twitter or anywhere else saying God is like Santa Claus, or God is like fairies, or God is like leprechauns, or whatever, these things that we actively disbelieve exist. Because what you're doing there is you're showing your hand that you don't merely lack a belief. I can have a meaningful conversation with someone who does compare God to Santa Claus or pixies or leprechauns or whatever else. But the person that I can't have a meaningful conversation with, is someone who is saying they're kind of a lack of belief styled atheist, but then all the time comparing God to entities and things that we actively disbelieve in.
Why? Why is it so hard for you?
It might be that you actually do disbelieve that God exists, actively disbelieve. And you should know that about yourself. And then that should change how you have these conversations.
How would your conversation with them change? Do you think it would mean that they have a burden of proof? Because if you do, then you're wrong. Even if this comparison means that they believe that God doesn't exist, that still doesn't mean that that's what they assert in the context of your conversation. So it has no bearing on the burden of proof, and I don't see what bearing it has on how you have this conversation. Ideally, in a conversation, each side would present what they assert, which would really help establish who needs to prove what. I think that when it's not specifically laid out, though, the burden of proof should lie solely on the side trying to disprove the null hypothesis. And as I said, we atheists generally see God doesn't exist as the appropriate null hypothesis. We don't assert that God doesn't exist. If anything, we assert just two smaller things: that we haven't seen any good reason to believe that God does exist, and that until we do see such reason, the correct position to assume is that it doesn't. One thing I will concede is that we do have a burden of proof of sorts regarding what the default position should be. If we assert a null hypothesis, we should be able to convince you of it. And the same goes in the other direction. Unfortunately, there's no default position. And I believe that if you're really interested in taking this conversation forward, the most important thing that we need to hash out, in the absence of any absolute proof of any kind either way, is what the null hypothesis should be. And while we're at it, maybe also how high on the scale we need to go before we switch conclusions. I believe that God does not exist is the only reasonable null hypothesis, and that we actually need to be convinced to a very high degree, like a 98 or something, before we reject the null hypothesis and accept that God does exist. But if you feel that I'm wrong and that you can defend this proposition, then let's discuss. Like I said, I think that this is the thing that can really take this conversation farther. So you can comment down below, you can email me or find me on social media, and yeah, let's try to hash it out. I hope this clarifies why I think that even if this dilemma were true, it really isn't that important. And now to why I think the dilemma is not actually a dilemma at all. So firstly, I think that theists usually implicitly assume that the word God refers to their God. Even if they are aware intellectually that this is not necessarily the case, as I'm sure that Braxton and Cameron are, something within them kind of still feels like it is. So when atheists say that they lack belief in God, Braxton and Cameron seem to think that we mean we're on the fence about their Lord and Savior. And that's simply not what we're saying. One thing that I actually think stems from them being in what Braxton refers to as debate mode is that they miss the fact that sometimes the atheist does actually explicitly clarify that the reason they say that they lack belief is that even though they are sure that some God concepts don't exist in reality, they can't be sure that nothing that could reasonably be described as God exists.
The interesting thing here is that I'm not here to disprove God. My position is not even, there is no God, which is what everybody thinks the atheist position is. Instead, I am not convinced that there is a God. And for some gods, I'm actually convinced that they don't exist.
And while Braxton and Cameron don't name names in this video, I feel that I can assume that Matt Dillahunty and other AXP network personas are probably among those that they refer to. But even if they're not, these two guys must have listened to at least a few discussions on the atheist experience. I'd be really surprised if they never encountered this explanation. And I seriously wonder why they didn't mention it once in their video, not even in the objections part. But the main misunderstanding seems to be that they think that lacking belief means we're somehow on the fence, like waiting to be convinced.
If your definition of atheism is merely that it's a lack of belief in God and you're just waiting to be convinced,
That's not the case. And here, it ties back to the null hypothesis thing from before. I lack belief in God in pretty much the exact same way that I lack belief in the Loch Ness Monster or in Santa Claus. I can't be sure either of them doesn't exist, but that doesn't mean that I'm somehow undecided.
and the word merely in your hundred, in the way you've articulated the hunter's dilemma, is pretty important. They claim to merely lack a belief.
Yeah.
I don't know, I think what they're trying to say here is that the word merely somehow makes it mean that, but it doesn't. All it means is that I'm not making any other claim about God's existence. I'm not making any assertions. I am merely claiming that I haven't been convinced that I should reject or even consider rejecting the null hypothesis. Some God concepts seem to contradict fundamental things that I know about reality. Sometimes they even contradict themselves. I'm nearly certain that God, as defined by these concepts, does not exist. But I'm also aware that there are proposed solutions to those contradictions. None of those solutions strikes me as remotely convincing, but still I can't be sure that my understanding is correct. And even if there were no proposed solutions, I still can't be sure that my understanding is correct. I am certain that these gods don't exist, pretty much to the highest degree that I can be certain of anything, but that highest degree is still not 100%. Other God concepts are far more nebulous, or at least interact less with reality. Some deistic notions of God go as far as having no interaction with our reality at all. So I can't be sure that these gods don't exist. I can't even be somewhat convinced that they don't exist, but I also can't be convinced of anything else about them. Personally, I'm fairly convinced that an omnipotent, omnibenevolent creator of the universe contradicts enough of what I know about reality to be able to say that I am convinced that such a God does not exist. I can also say that some people put the label of God on things that I absolutely believe exist, like math or the universe. And in this case, maybe we can say that God does exist, but I just don't think it makes much sense to use the God label for the thing we're talking about. The thing in the middle, deism and other similarly nebulous ideas, might be reasonably labeled as God. And for those gods, I honestly can say that I'm convinced that they don't exist. But, and this is important, even for God concepts of this latter category, I'm not on the fence. I'm not waiting to be convinced. The fact that I can't rule out their existence doesn't mean that I have any reason to entertain the idea that they might exist. I see no reason to have them as any part of my concept of truth or reality. It's not that the evidence that I've seen or the arguments that I've heard weren't enough to convince me. It's that they weren't enough to even get me to think it might be an option. Think Bigfoot, or fairies, or major-scale voter fraud in the 2020 elections. I can't say it's not a thing, but I have very little reason to even entertain the idea. To me, God is the same, but far more far-fetched. I literally have zero suspicion that they might exist. I just know that I can't rule them out. A couple of days ago, I actually thought of a nice analogy. You know those giant 3-meter worms that live near hydrothermal vents in the deep ocean? No one in the world knew about them 50 years ago. It's not that people held an active disbelief in those creatures. They simply had no reason to seriously think about the idea. But if anyone said back then that they know these worms don't exist, they'd clearly be mistaken. In a similar way, no one knew back then anything about 5-meter koalas that live underneath the seabed. The difference is that we still don't know anything about subterranean deep-sea koalas today. And just like those people 50 years ago who didn't know anything about the giant sea worms, we're still not justifying in saying that we have an active belief that subterranean deep-sea koalas don't exist. But that doesn't mean we have any reasons to think that maybe they do exist, let alone to wait for evidence for it. We inactively believe that they don't exist. Most things that we have no reason to believe exist don't exist. Some do. We will be able to know which ones those are only after we will have good reason to think they exist. For now, I believe in giant tube worms and not in subterranean deep-sea koalas. The same goes for God. No reason to think it's even an option, but no real possibility of ruling it out. But as opposed to subterranean deep-sea koalas, God actually does take up a fair bit of my mind space. Here I am making a video about him, and there are many more still to come. And it's actually even worse. The God that takes up this mind space isn't even in the category that I'm agnostic about. It's a God that I'm actually pretty certain can't exist. So why do I spend my time on that God and not on the far more likely subterranean deep-sea koalas? Well, it's not because there's any chance that that God exists. It's just because the discourse surrounding the notion of that God most certainly does exist. And it impacts all of our lives, every day, all around the world. Actually, in the video for this challenge, there's another nice analogy.
I would go so far as to assert that there are no tigers in my office. But if I'm doing that, and I'm asserting that, say, in a debate, then I've got to defend that.
The way you might do that is to show that the entity that we refer to as a tiger is an animal that if it were in the room, like the size of the room you're in right now, you would expect to be able to see it.
No, sorry, that wasn't the analogy yet. I just wanted to pause to point out that I guess without noticing, Braxton actually just gave the argument from feline hiddenness.
Let's say that we're in a building with 2 rooms, but the room we're in doesn't have a door. And to get to the door on the other side of the other room, we have to go through that other room. And person A says, I believe that there is a tiger that will likely kill us, we could say, in the next room. And another person B says, I believe there is not a tiger in the next room. So now each of these people is making a claim. And so each person making a claim has to give some reason why there is or isn't a tiger there.
Yeah, cool. So let's illustrate this a bit more. You're in a room in your house with a couple of other people. This room that you're in has no windows and only has one door, leading you to the corridor. So if you want to get out of the house, go to the toilet, go grab a glass of water, if you want to do any of those things, you have to go through the corridor. Oh, and that door between the room you're in and the corridor is closed. And let's assume for the purpose of this example that being eaten by a tiger is worse than any other thing that could happen to you. Now, one of these people tells you that there is a tiger in the corridor. The other tells you that there isn't. As Braxton rightly pointed out, they both have a burden of proof here, because they both made assertions. But what about if none of them is able to make a convincing case for their claims? If P is there's a tiger in the corridor, you're at 0. You don't have an active belief that there is a tiger there. You don't have an active belief that there isn't. Do you open the door? Do you see why you need a default position? What about if the second person doesn't say anything? Actually, instead of 2 people, let's say it's just one person, a good friend of yours. This friend tells you that there is a tiger there. Do you stay in the room forever? No, it's not just that it's a friend. You know that friend to be an honest person. And this friend entered the room after you, running, telling you there's a tiger out there, and you close the door behind them. If these are the events, you might have good reason to believe what they say about the tiger. Maybe you just stay in this room with no access to a toilet, to water, to the outside world, because remember, being eaten by a tiger is so much worse in this example. But what about if you know that generally there aren't any wild tigers or zoos anywhere near where you live? So it's very unlikely that a tiger somehow found its way there. Would you still be willing to stay in that room? Would you trust your good, reliable friend wasn't just seeing things? What if you know the house's door and windows were all closed, and that there definitely wasn't a tiger in there when you went into this room? Still, I think there is a chance you might believe your friend, but I mean, you have to be really sure, right? You're giving up so much because you believe what this person told you. If you were at 100 on the scale, you'd definitely stay in the room. If you were at 50, you'd probably still stay in the room. At 20? I don't know. So in this scenario, would you be above whatever your threshold is? Would you trust that there really is a tiger enough to never go outside again? I still think that if it were me, there is a chance that I would. But what about if we change it from this last scenario? Just that your friend went into the room with you and you closed the door behind you. They say they heard a noise and they can't think of any better explanation other than a tiger. They didn't see the tiger, of course. They couldn't. They have no way of knowing there's a tiger there, but they're sure they heard a noise. And really, what else could it be? Do you have a better explanation? And you're getting kind of thirsty. What do? Remember, you have literally no way of disproving your friend's claim that there's a tiger out there without opening the door. It's just that it doesn't make any sense that there would be a tiger. Do you have enough belief in your friend to reject your default position and believe that there is a tiger outside, denying some of your most human urges and staying in that room forever and ever? If you do open the door in this scenario, this is pretty much what lacking belief means. You lack belief about there being a tiger out there. Or you can say that you have an inactive belief that there isn't a tiger out there. Your default position is that there's no tiger in the corridor, and your friend's assertion that there is a tiger there simply could not convince you otherwise. In this last example, I'd probably actually hold an inactive belief that this friend is just wrong. I'd probably feel pretty sure that there is no tiger out there. This is what lacking belief means. Or at least this is part of the spectrum of what it means. So while usually atheists will mainly use this phrase to cover all their bases, and many of us will feel very comfortable saying that we actually actively believe that the Abrahamic God doesn't exist, even those of us who say they just lack belief regarding that God still don't mean that they're on the fence. Not any more than you were about the tiger in the corridor in that last scenario. In conclusion, for the most part, when atheists say that they merely lack belief, they aren't talking about your God. They're talking about all the God concepts out there, and they'd often also say that for some specific gods, they do believe in their non-existence. But even those who say they lack belief in your God often mean it in the sense that they aren't sure that your God doesn't exist, but that until they are convinced otherwise, they remain with the default, which is not to accept your claim. This is what their lack of belief means. Lack of belief is not the same as being on the fence, and there is no contradiction between that and believing that God doesn't exist until someone proves otherwise. And so this is a false dilemma. I guess some people are truly on the fence regarding your God claim. They find your arguments or evidence or maybe their experiences somewhat convincing, but not enough. I find it hard to believe that they make these comparisons to Santa or whatever. Finally, and most importantly, even if there is some contradiction between these two statements, it has no bearing on our burden of proof, so you shouldn't be so bothered by this. Let's just make sure that we agree on a null hypothesis and that we understand what level of convincing it would take for us to reject it. I really think this would be the best way to have more productive conversations and debates. Now on to you, the viewer. What do you think? Is there a contradiction between these two statements? Were Cameron and Braxton right about this dilemma? Does it even matter? Is there a tiger in your room? How do you know? Leave a comment down below. By the way, while I was working on the tiger analogy, I ended up developing it to an analogy that also explains why I personally would be willing to assert that the Abrahamic God does not exist. If you want to see this full analogy, you can find the link in the description. There's also another video that I made that you can find down there, responding specifically to the fake news signs bit. I didn't see this as important enough to take more time in this video. If you found this video interesting or fun, how about clicking that like button? If you're somehow not subscribed yet, you might want to fix that situation also. Another easy thing that you can do that would really help me is continue from this video to one of my other videos. This really helps me with YouTube's algorithm. And, as usual, more ways to help me simplify some of the complexities of our existence can be found down below. Thank you all so much for watching, and have a good one.